The morning sun rose slowly over the magnificent towers of Buckingham Palace, casting long golden shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens that stretched out like a green carpet beneath the ancient stone walls. It was a day like any other in the heart of London, where tourists gathered at the iron gates hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty, where journalists waited with their cameras ready, and where the staff inside the palace moved with practiced precision through their daily routines. But this particular morning would prove to be anything but ordinary. This was the morning that would change everything for one man, one woman, and, ultimately, the entire perception of what it means to serve the crown. Thomas William Hartley had served as a royal guard for nearly 22 years. He had stood at attention through rain and shine, through bitter winter cold and scorching summer heat. He had watched prime ministers come and go, had seen celebrations and mournings, had witnessed history unfold from his position at the gates. His uniform was always perfect, his posture always straight, his dedication always unwavering. At 53 years old, Thomas was considered one of the most respected members of the Royal Guard, a man whose commitment to duty was legendary among his colleagues. Thomas came from a long line of military men. His father had served in the Second World War, his grandfather in the First. Service to the nation was not just a job for Thomas Hartley. It was a calling, a sacred duty that ran through his blood like the River Thames ran through London. He had joined the army at 18, fresh out of school with dreams of honor and glory. He had served in conflicts around the world, had earned medals for bravery, had watched friends fall in battle. When the opportunity came to join the Royal Guard, Thomas had considered it the highest honor of his career. But honor, Thomas had learned over the years, was a complicated thing. It was not just about standing straight and looking impressive. It was not just about following orders without question. True honor, he believed, came from within. It came from knowing the difference between right and wrong, from standing up for what mattered even when it was difficult. This belief would soon be tested in ways Thomas never could have imagined. The morning began with the usual routines. Thomas woke at 5 o'clock, as he had done every day for more than 2 decades. He showered, shaved, and dressed with military precision. Every button was polished, every crease was sharp, every thread was in place. He ate a simple breakfast of toast and eggs, kissed his wife Margaret goodbye, and drove through the quiet London streets to the palace. The city was still sleeping, but Thomas was already alert, already focused on the day ahead. Margaret had noticed something different about her husband lately. After 30 years of marriage, she knew him better than anyone. She had seen him troubled before, had watched him struggle with the memories of war, had held him through the nightmares that sometimes came in the night. But this was different. There was a heaviness in his eyes that she could not quite understand. When she asked him about it, he would simply shake his head and say that everything was fine. But Margaret knew that everything was not fine. Something was weighing on Thomas Hartley's soul. The truth was that Thomas had been watching and listening for months. He had observed things within the palace that troubled him deeply. He had seen how certain members of staff were treated, had heard conversations that made him uncomfortable, had witnessed moments of cruelty disguised as authority. Thomas was old-fashioned in many ways. He believed in respect, in kindness, in treating every person with dignity regardless of their position in life. What he had been seeing lately did not align with those beliefs. At the palace, Thomas took his position at the main entrance. The other guards nodded to him with respect as they passed. Among the younger men, Thomas was something of a legend. They knew his history, knew about his medals, knew about his years of flawless service. They came to him for advice, for guidance, for wisdom. Thomas always tried to help them, always tried to pass on what he had learned. He told them that being a guard was not about looking impressive for the tourists. It was about serving with integrity, about representing the best of what Britain could be. The first few hours of the morning passed quietly. Tourists gathered at the gates, taking pictures and hoping to make the guards smile. Thomas stood perfectly still, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. This was a skill he had mastered long ago. No matter what happened around him, he could remain completely motionless, completely composed. Inside, however, his mind was active. He thought about his wife, about his 2 grown children, about his grandchildren who loved to hear stories about the palace. He thought about his father, who had died 10 years ago, and wondered what the old man would think if he could see him now. Around mid-morning, word spread among the guards that there would be a special event that afternoon. The Queen Consort would be greeting a delegation of foreign dignitaries in the main courtyard. This was not unusual. Such events happened regularly at the palace. What was unusual was the additional instruction that came down from above. All guards in the courtyard area were to show special deference to the Queen Consort. They were to bow whenever she passed, were to respond immediately to any request she made, were to ensure that everything was perfect for the visiting delegation. Thomas felt a slight tightening in his chest when he heard these instructions. He had been present at many such events before. He knew the protocols, knew what was expected. But there was something in the tone of the instructions that bothered him. Something that suggested this was not just about normal protocol. Something that hinted at the changes that had been taking place within the palace over recent months. The relationship between Camilla and the palace staff had been complicated from the beginning. When she first arrived as the wife of Prince Charles, many of the longer-serving staff members had struggled to adjust. They remembered Princess Diana, remembered her warmth and her kindness, remembered how she had treated everyone from the highest lords to the lowest servants with equal respect. Camilla was different. She came from a different world, had different expectations, had a different way of relating to those around her. Over the years, most of the staff had come to accept Camilla. She had her own qualities, her own strengths. She had stood by Charles through difficult times, had supported him in his duties, had gradually won over much of the British public. But, among some of the older staff members, there remained a quiet resistance. They served her because it was their duty, but they did not forget the past. They did not forget Diana. Thomas tried not to let such thoughts affect his work. He was a professional. His personal opinions about the royal family were irrelevant to his duties. He was there to serve, to protect, to represent the crown. It was not his place to judge. And, yet, as the months passed, Thomas found it increasingly difficult to remain neutral. He had heard stories from other staff members. He had seen small moments of unkindness. He had watched as good people were dismissed or demoted for minor infractions. Something was changing at the palace, and it was not a change for the better. That afternoon, Thomas was reassigned from the main gate to the courtyard where the dignitaries would be received. He took his position along with 6 other guards, standing at attention in a perfect line. The courtyard was magnificent, with its ancient stones and its carefully tended flower beds. Flags flew from the towers above. Everything was prepared for the arrival of the guests. The dignitaries arrived first, a group of diplomats from several European nations. They were greeted by palace officials and led to a waiting area where refreshments had been prepared. Thomas watched them from his position, noting their expensive suits and their confident manner. These were powerful people, people who were accustomed to being treated with respect. They laughed and talked among themselves, completely ignoring the guards who stood motionless along the walls. Then, the Queen Consort appeared. Camilla walked into the courtyard with an entourage of assistants and aides. She was dressed elegantly, as always, with jewelry that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Her face was composed, her posture regal. She acknowledged the dignitaries with a gracious smile and began the process of greeting each one personally. Thomas watched as she moved through the crowd, shaking hands, making small talk, playing the role of royal hostess with practiced ease. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. The dignitaries were charmed, the photographers captured their pictures, the event proceeded according to plan. Thomas felt his tension begin to ease. Perhaps he had been worried for nothing. Perhaps this would be just another routine day at the palace. Perhaps all his concerns had been unfounded. But, then, something happened that changed everything. One of the younger guards, a man named James Morrison, shifted slightly in his position. It was a tiny movement, barely noticeable, caused by a cramp in his leg after standing still for so long. James was new to the Royal Guard, had only been serving for about a year. He was 25 years old, eager to prove himself, terrified of making mistakes. The slight movement was involuntary, a physical reaction that he could not control. Under normal circumstances, no one would have noticed. Under normal circumstances, it would have been completely insignificant. But Camilla noticed. She turned her head sharply, her eyes finding James immediately. The warmth that had been in her expression moments before disappeared, replaced by something cold and hard. She excused herself from the diplomat she had been speaking with and walked directly toward the young guard. The clicking of her heels on the stone courtyard seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Thomas watched from his position, his heart beginning to beat faster. He could see the fear in James's eyes, could see the young man struggling to maintain his composure. Thomas wanted to do something, wanted to intervene, but he knew that was impossible. Guards did not break their positions. Guards did not speak unless spoken to. Guards certainly did not interfere when a member of the royal family was addressing one of their colleagues. Camilla stopped directly in front of James. She looked him up and down with an expression of obvious displeasure. The dignitaries had fallen silent, watching the scene with curiosity. The photographers had lowered their cameras, sensing that something significant was happening. The entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath. When Camilla spoke, her voice was low but perfectly audible in the silence. She asked James what he thought he was doing. She asked him if he understood the importance of this event. She asked him if he realized that his small movement had been disrespectful, had been unprofessional, had been an embarrassment to the crown. James tried to apologize, tried to explain about the cramp in his leg, but Camilla cut him off. She was not interested in excuses. She was interested in discipline. What happened next would become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the palace for weeks to come. Camilla, in front of the dignitaries, in front of the photographers, in front of everyone, demanded that James kneel before her. She said that if he could not stand properly like a guard, then perhaps he should kneel like a servant. She said that kneeling might remind him of his proper place, might teach him the respect that he obviously lacked. Thomas felt something break inside him. He had served the royal family for more than 2 decades. He had sworn oaths of loyalty, had dedicated his life to his duty. But he had never sworn to stand by while a young man was humiliated for no reason. He had never agreed to watch in silence while cruelty was disguised as discipline. He looked at James, saw the devastation in the young man's eyes, saw the way his hands were trembling at his sides. The moment stretched out like an eternity. James began to lower himself, began to bend his knees, began to submit to the demand. The dignitaries watched with expressions of discomfort. Some of them looked away, embarrassed to witness such a scene. Others seemed almost entertained, as if they were watching a drama unfold for their amusement. Thomas knew that he had a choice to make. He could remain silent, remain still, remain the perfect guard that he had always been. He could let James kneel, could let the moment pass, could pretend that nothing unusual had happened. That would be the safe choice, the expected choice, the choice that would protect his career and his pension and his reputation. Or he could do something else entirely. The years of service flashed through Thomas's mind. He thought about what it meant to wear the uniform, what it meant to serve the crown. He thought about honor and duty and loyalty. He thought about his father, who had fought in a war against tyranny, who had believed that every human being deserved to be treated with dignity. He thought about his own children, about what kind of example he wanted to set for them. And then, before he fully realized what he was doing, Thomas Hartley moved. He stepped out of his position, breaking the line of guards for the first time in his career. His boots sounded loud on the stone as he walked toward where Camilla stood before the kneeling James. Every eye in the courtyard turned toward him. The photographers raised their cameras again, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Thomas stopped a few feet away from the queen consort. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. His face was calm, his posture still perfect despite having broken formation. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, carrying across the courtyard so that everyone could hear. He addressed her with the proper title, with the respect that her position demanded. But, then, he said something that no guard had ever said before. He told her that he could not stand by and watch this happen. He told her that James Morrison was a good soldier, a dedicated young man who had done nothing wrong. He told her that forcing him to kneel in humiliation was not discipline. It was cruelty. And cruelty, Thomas said, had no place in the service of the crown. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Camilla stared at Thomas with an expression of utter disbelief. In all her years as a member of the royal family, no one had ever spoken to her like this. No servant, no guard, no staff member had ever dared to challenge her authority so directly, so publicly. Thomas turned to James, who was still on his knees, and extended his hand. He helped the young man to his feet, told him to return to his position, told him that he had nothing to be ashamed of. James looked at Thomas with tears in his eyes, with gratitude and confusion and fear all mixed together. He returned to his place in the line, standing straight once more. Then, Thomas turned back to Camilla. He told her that he had served the royal family faithfully for more than 20 years. He told her that he had stood at attention through everything that life had thrown at him. He told her that he believed in the monarchy, believed in the traditions and the history and the importance of what the crown represented. But, he also told her that the crown was only as worthy as the people who wore it. The crown was only as noble as the actions taken in its name. He said that if kneeling in humiliation was what the crown now demanded, then, perhaps it was time for him to reconsider his service. He said that he would rather lose his position than lose his integrity. He said that some things were more important than duty, and one of those things was standing up for what was right. The courtyard erupted into chaos. The dignitaries began talking rapidly among themselves. The photographers snapped picture after picture. Palace officials rushed forward, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to handle this unprecedented situation. And, through it all, Thomas Hartley stood perfectly still, waiting to see what would happen next. He knew that his career was almost certainly over. He knew that there would be consequences for what he had done. But, as he stood there in that courtyard, with the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace rising around him, Thomas felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt free. The events of that afternoon would ripple outward in ways that no one could have predicted. What started as a simple confrontation between a guard and the Queen Consort would become something much larger, much more significant. It would force people to ask difficult questions about power and privilege, about tradition and change, about what it truly means to serve. But, all of that was still to come. In that moment, as the sun began to set over the palace and the shadows grew long across the courtyard, there was only Thomas Hartley, standing tall in his uniform, refusing to kneel. The story of what happened that day would spread quickly. First through the palace, then through London, then through all of Britain and beyond. People would take sides, would argue about who was right and who was wrong. Some would call Thomas a hero. Others would call him a traitor. But everyone would agree on one thing. Nothing at Buckingham Palace would ever be quite the same again. As Thomas was led away from the courtyard by palace officials, he walked with his head held high. James Morrison watched him go with tears streaming down his face. The other guards remained at attention, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes betrayed their emotions. They had witnessed something remarkable, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And Camilla, the Queen Consort, stood alone in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by confused dignitaries and clicking cameras, realizing perhaps for the first time that authority comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it. The first chapter of this story had ended. But the story itself was only beginning. That night, as Thomas drove home through the darkened streets of London, he thought about what he had done. He thought about Margaret waiting for him, about how he would explain everything that had happened. He thought about his career, about his pension, about all the years of service that might now mean nothing. He thought about whether he had made the right decision. But, when he remembered the look on James Morrison's face, when he remembered what it had felt like to stand up for what he believed in, Thomas knew that he would make the same choice again. Some things, he realized, were worth fighting for. And, sometimes, the bravest thing a soldier can do is refuse to kneel. The news spread through Buckingham Palace like wildfire through dry brush. By the time the sun had fully set on that extraordinary afternoon, every staff member, every servant, every guard knew what had happened in the courtyard.
Whispers traveled through the ancient corridors, passed from one shocked mouth to another shocked ear.
Thomas Hartley, the legendary guard with more than 2 decades of perfect service, had defied the Queen Consort. He had stepped out of formation, had spoken words that no one had ever dared to speak, had helped a fellow guard to his feet when he had been ordered to kneel. The very foundations of palace protocol seemed to tremble. In the servants' quarters below the main halls, people gathered in small groups to discuss what they had heard. Some spoke with admiration in their voices, calling Thomas brave and principled. Others spoke with fear, warning that what he had done was dangerous, that there would be consequences not just for him but, possibly for everyone who worked in the palace. A few remained silent, their own thoughts and feelings too complicated to put into words.
Meanwhile, in her private chambers, Camilla sat alone.
The dignitaries had been escorted away, the event concluded in a fog of confusion and barely concealed scandal. Her aides had tried to speak with her, had tried to offer comfort and advice, but she had sent them all away. She needed time to think, time to process what had happened, time to decide how to respond. The humiliation burned inside her like a fire. In all her years of public life, through all the scandals and criticisms and challenges she had faced, Camilla had never been spoken to the way Thomas Hartley had spoken to her that afternoon. She had never been publicly contradicted by someone so far beneath her station. The image of him standing there, calm and dignified, telling her that cruelty had no place in the service of the crown, played over and over in her mind. Part of her wanted revenge. Part of her wanted Thomas Hartley dismissed immediately, stripped of his medals, his pension, his good name. Part of her wanted to make an example of him, to show everyone in the palace that such behavior would not be tolerated. She was the Queen Consort, the wife of the king, one of the most powerful women in the nation. How dare a common guard speak to her in such a manner? How dare he undermine her authority in front of foreign visitors? But another part of Camilla, a smaller and quieter part, was troubled by something else entirely. She kept thinking about the young guard who had been on his knees. She kept thinking about the look on his face, the fear and the shame in his eyes. She had demanded that he kneel because she had been embarrassed by his small movement, because she had felt that her authority was being challenged. But had the punishment fit the crime? Had there even been a crime at all? These thoughts were unfamiliar to Camilla. She was not accustomed to questioning herself, to doubting her own decisions. She had spent years building a shell of confidence around herself, a protection against all the criticism and hostility she had faced from a public that had never fully accepted her. That shell had served her well. It had allowed her to survive, to endure, to eventually claim her place at the side of the king. But, now, sitting alone in her chambers as darkness fell over London, Camilla felt that shell beginning to crack. The night passed slowly. Across the city, in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, Thomas Hartley sat with his wife Margaret at their kitchen table. He had told her everything, had described every moment of what had happened in the courtyard. Margaret had listened in silence, her face growing increasingly pale as the story unfolded. When he finished, she simply stared at him for a long moment. Then, she reached across the table and took his hand. She told him that she was proud of him. She told him that what he had done was right, that standing up for that young man was exactly what his father would have done, exactly what any person of conscience should do. She told him that whatever happened next, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else in their 30 years of marriage. Thomas felt tears pricking at his eyes. He had been prepared for anger, for fear, for accusations that he had thrown away their security for the sake of a moment of principle. He had not been prepared for his wife's quiet pride, for her unwavering support. He squeezed her hand and told her that he loved her. She smiled and told him that she loved him too, and that they should get some sleep because tomorrow was going to be a very long day. They were not wrong about that. The morning papers arrived like bombs exploding across the nation. Somehow, despite all the palace's efforts at discretion, the story had leaked to the press. The photographs from the courtyard were splashed across every front page. Thomas Hartley's face, calm and resolute, was seen by millions of people as they ate their breakfast and drank their morning tea. The headlines screamed about confrontation, about defiance, about a guard who had dared to challenge the Queen Consort herself. Social media erupted into a frenzy of debate. Some people condemned Thomas as disloyal, as disrespectful, as someone who had betrayed his oath of service. They argued that whatever had happened in the courtyard, a guard had no right to speak to a member of the royal family in such a manner. They worried about what this meant for tradition, for protocol, for the very fabric of the monarchy. But far more people praised Thomas as a hero. They shared the photographs and the accounts of what had happened, adding their own commentary about the importance of standing up against injustice. They wrote long posts about dignity and respect, about how no one should be forced to kneel in humiliation regardless of their position in life. The story resonated with something deep in the public consciousness, something that went beyond politics or royal protocol. At the palace, a crisis meeting was called. Senior officials gathered in a grand conference room to discuss how to respond. There were lawyers present, public relations experts, representatives from various departments. The king himself was briefed on the situation, though he chose not to attend the meeting directly. His response, relayed through an aide, was simply that he trusted his advisors to handle the matter appropriately. The discussions went on for hours. Some officials argued for immediate and decisive action against Thomas Hartley. They said that his behavior was unacceptable, that it set a dangerous precedent, that if he was not punished severely then, other staff members might think they could challenge authority whenever they disagreed with something. They pointed to generations of tradition, to the importance of discipline and hierarchy, to the need to maintain order within the palace. Others argued for a more measured approach. They noted the public reaction, the widespread support for Thomas Hartley, the potential damage to the monarchy's image if they were seen to be punishing a man for standing up against what many perceived as bullying. They reminded their colleagues that the monarchy's survival depended on public goodwill, that in the modern age, appearances mattered more than ever. They suggested that perhaps, instead of punishing Thomas, they should find a way to quietly resolve the situation. The debate went back and forth, voices rising and falling, proposals offered and rejected. Through it all, one question remained unanswered. What did Camilla herself want to happen? She had not attended the meeting, had not sent any instructions or preferences. Her silence was both noted and respected. No one wanted to be the person who made a decision that contradicted the wishes of the queen consort. While the officials debated, Thomas Hartley was asked to report to a small administrative office in a distant corner of the palace. He arrived in his uniform, freshly pressed despite everything, his medals gleaming on his chest. He was not sure what to expect. Perhaps they would fire him on the spot. Perhaps they would offer him a chance to apologize and keep his job. Perhaps they would simply ask him to explain himself, to justify his actions. What he found was a sympathetic official named Harold Bennett who had worked at the palace for nearly as long as Thomas had. Harold was in his 60s, a grandfatherly man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He had been assigned to speak with Thomas not because of any official position, but because he was known for his ability to handle delicate situations with discretion. Harold invited Thomas to sit down and offered him tea. For a while, they simply talked about ordinary things. The weather, the traffic, the difficulty of finding good help these days. It was clear that Harold was trying to put Thomas at ease, trying to create an atmosphere of trust before addressing the elephant in the room. Finally, Harold set down his teacup and looked directly at Thomas. He said that he had heard what happened in the courtyard. He said that he had also heard the official accounts and the unofficial ones, the versions that were already spreading through the palace. He wanted to hear Thomas's version, in his own words, from the beginning to the end. Thomas told his story. He spoke calmly and clearly, describing the events of the previous day without embellishment or excuse. He explained about James Morrison, about the cramp in his leg, about the demand that he kneel. He explained about his own decision to step forward, about the words he had spoken, about his belief that what was happening was wrong. He did not apologize for his actions, but he did not claim that he had been entirely right either. He acknowledged that he had broken protocol, had violated his training, had done something that no guard should do. Harold listened without interruption. When Thomas finished, the older man was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said something that surprised Thomas completely. He said that in all his years at the palace, through all the changes and the scandals and the challenges, he had rarely seen an act of such simple courage. He said that what Thomas had done was extraordinary, not because it was rebellious, but because it was human. The palace, Harold explained, was a place where humanity was often sacrificed on the altar of protocol. People were expected to suppress their feelings, their opinions, their instincts in service of the institution.
Most of the time, this was necessary and even valuable.
Tradition and discipline held things together, provided stability in a changing world. But, sometimes, Harold said, the traditions needed to bend. Sometimes the protocols needed to give way to something more fundamental.
Thomas did not know how to respond to this. He had expected condemnation, not understanding. He had expected to be treated as a problem to be solved, not as a person to be listened to. He felt a surge of gratitude toward Harold Bennett, toward this kind old man who seemed to see something in him that others might have missed. But, Harold's sympathy, genuine as it was, did not change the reality of the situation. There would still be consequences for what Thomas had done. The officials were still debating, the press was still buzzing, the public was still watching. Something would have to happen, some response would have to be made. The only question was what form that response would take. As Thomas left the administrative office and walked through the palace corridors, he noticed that other staff members were looking at him differently. Some smiled and nodded, their eyes conveying silent support.
Others looked away quickly, as if afraid to be associated with him. A few blared openly, their expressions hostile and disapproving. The palace, it seemed, was as divided as the nation itself. That afternoon, something unexpected happened.
James Morrison, the young guard whose humiliation had sparked the entire confrontation, asked to speak with Thomas.
They met in a quiet corner of the guards' quarters, away from prying eyes and listening ears. James was visibly nervous, his hands shaking slightly, his voice unsteady when he spoke. He thanked Thomas for what he had done. He said that he had never experienced anything like what happened in that courtyard, that the shame and the fear had been overwhelming. He said that when Thomas stepped forward, when Thomas helped him to his feet, it had been like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. He would never forget it, not for as long as he lived. But James was also worried. He was worried about Thomas, about what might happen to him, about the consequences that were surely coming. He said that it was not fair, that Thomas should not have to suffer for doing the right thing. He asked if there was anything he could do to help, any way he could support the man who had supported him. Thomas put a hand on James's shoulder and told him that the best thing he could do was to keep being a good guard. He told him that what happened in the courtyard was not his fault, that he had nothing to apologize for. He told him that sometimes in life, we are tested in ways we do not expect, and that the measure of a person is how they respond to those tests. James had responded with dignity, even when dignity was being stripped away from him. That was something to be proud of.
James nodded, tears in his eyes.
He asked Thomas how he could be so calm, so at peace with everything that was happening.
Thomas thought about the question for a moment before answering.
He said that he had made a choice that aligned with his deepest values, and that once you make such a choice, the consequences become easier to bear. It was not about being brave, he said. It was about being true to yourself. The two men parted ways, but their conversation would stay with both of them. For James, it was the beginning of a transformation, a shift in how he understood his role and his responsibilities. For Thomas, it was a reminder of why he had done what he did, of the human being at the center of the storm. The days that followed were a strange mixture of tension and routine. Thomas continued to report for duty, though he was assigned to low-profile positions far from the main areas of the palace. He stood guard at service entrances, at rarely used gates, at corners of the grounds where tourists never ventured. It was clear that the officials were keeping him out of sight while they decided what to do with him.
The press continued to cover the story obsessively.
Reporters camped outside the palace gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of Thomas or to interview anyone who might have information about what was happening inside. Editorials were written, debates were held, opinions were expressed with increasing passion on both sides. The story had captured the national imagination in a way that few palace incidents ever had. And, through it all, Camilla remained silent. She made her scheduled public appearances, smiled for the cameras, performed her duties with the grace and poise that was expected of her. But she gave no interviews about the incident, made no public statements, offered no indication of how she felt or what she wanted to happen. Her silence was perhaps the most significant element of the entire situation. Behind closed doors, however, Camilla was going through her own transformation. The questions that had begun on the night of the incident continued to multiply, to deepen, to challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. She found herself thinking about her own history, about the years of criticism and rejection she had endured, about the way she had been forced to adapt and survive. She thought about what it felt like to be looked down upon, to be treated as unworthy, to have your dignity stripped away by people who believed they were better than you. She had experienced all of those things. She had known what it was like to be judged unfairly, to be condemned without a hearing, to be treated as less than human by a public that did not know her and did not want to know her. And, yet, in the courtyard, she had done the same thing to a young guard who had committed no real offense. She had demanded his humiliation, had stripped away his dignity, had treated him as less than human. The realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. Camilla began to understand that power, when it is not tempered by empathy, becomes cruelty. She began to see that the shell she had built around herself, the protection that had served her so well, had also hardened something inside her. She had become so focused on defending her own position, her own authority, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. One evening, Camilla asked to see the records of Thomas Hartley's service. An aide brought her the file, clearly surprised by the request. Camilla spent hours reading through it, learning about the man who had defied her. She read about his military service, his medals, his years of dedication to the Royal Guard. She read letters of commendation from superior officers, notes praising his character and his professionalism. She read about his wife Margaret and his 2 children, about his quiet life outside the palace walls. The more she read, the more Camilla realized that Thomas Hartley was not a rebel or a troublemaker. He was not someone who sought attention or controversy. He was simply a man of principle, a man who had reached a point where he could no longer remain silent. His defiance had not been about disrespecting her. It had been about respecting something he believed in more than protocol, more than tradition, more than his own career. This understanding did not make Camilla's embarrassment disappear. It did not erase the memory of standing in that courtyard, being told that her behavior was cruel. But it did shift something inside her, opened a door that had been closed for a very long time. She began to wonder if perhaps, instead of punishing Thomas Hartley, there might be another way forward. The crisis meeting continued, day after day, with no resolution in sight. The officials debated endlessly, unable to agree on a course of action. Some wanted to dismiss Thomas immediately, to send a clear message about the consequences of insubordination. Others wanted to find a compromise, perhaps a transfer to a different posting, a way to resolve the situation without further public spectacle. A few, emboldened by the public support for Thomas, suggested that no action should be taken at all, that the whole matter should simply be allowed to fade from memory. But, as the debate went on, everyone was aware of the same fundamental question. What did the Queen Consort want? Until she spoke, until she made her wishes known, nothing could really be decided. The officials were waiting for a signal, a direction, some indication of how to proceed. And, day after day, that signal did not come. Thomas Hartley waited too, in his own way. He continued to do his job, continued to wear his uniform with pride, continued to treat his colleagues and his duties with the same dedication he had always shown. The uncertainty weighed on him, of course. He could not help but think about what might happen, what his future might hold. But he had made peace with his decision, had accepted that whatever consequences came, they were worth bearing. Margaret Hartley watched her husband with a mixture of pride and worry. She saw the toll that the waiting was taking on him, the way his face grew more lined, the way his sleep was often troubled. She tried to support him as best she could, cooking his favorite meals, keeping their home peaceful and warm, reminding him every day that she stood beside him. Their marriage, already strong after 30 years, grew even stronger in the crucible of crisis. The public attention began to have unexpected effects. Letters arrived at the palace, thousands of them, addressed to Thomas Hartley. People from all over the country, and, indeed from around the world, wrote to express their support, their admiration, their gratitude for what he had done. Many of them shared their own stories, their own experiences of standing up against injustice, their own moments of courage that had changed their lives. Thomas read some of these letters, though there were too many to read them all. Each one moved him deeply. He had not expected this outpouring of support, had not anticipated that his simple act of conscience would resonate so widely. He began to realize that what had happened in the courtyard was not just about him and Camilla, not just about one moment in one place. It was about something larger, something that touched on universal human concerns about dignity and respect and the proper use of power. The palace staff, too, were affected by the ongoing situation. There was a noticeable change in the atmosphere, a shift in how people related to one another. Some of the old barriers seemed to break down, as servants and guards and officials found themselves drawn together by their shared experience of the crisis. Conversations happened that might not have happened before. Connections formed that might not have formed before. It was as if Thomas's act of defiance had created space for something new, something more human, to emerge. And, still, the Queen Consort remained silent. The days stretched into weeks, and the uncertainty continued. But change was coming. It was moving slowly, invisibly, through the ancient corridors of Buckingham Palace. It was growing in the hearts of those who had witnessed what happened, those who had read about it, those who had been touched by it in ways they could not fully explain. The next chapter of the story was about to begin. And, when it did, it would surprise everyone, including Thomas Hartley himself. For in the end, the greatest transformations are not the ones that happen in public courtyards, under the glare of cameras and the gaze of crowds. They are the ones that happen in the quiet chambers of the heart, where old certainties crumble and new possibilities take their place. Camilla was about to make a choice. And that choice would change everything. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the courtyard. The initial media frenzy had settled into a steady hum of speculation and commentary. The palace officials had continued their deliberations without reaching any conclusion. Thomas Hartley had continued his duties in obscurity, waiting for whatever fate awaited him. And Camilla had continued her silence, a silence that had become almost as famous as the incident itself. But, on this particular morning, something was different. Camilla woke before dawn, having barely slept at all. She lay in her bed for a long time, staring at the ornate ceiling above her, thinking about the decision she had made during the long hours of the night. It was a decision that went against everything she had been taught about power and authority, a decision that would surprise everyone who thought they knew her. But, it was the right decision. She was certain of that now. She rose and dressed carefully, choosing a simple outfit that was elegant but not ostentatious. She applied her makeup with steady hands, studied her reflection in the mirror for a long moment. The woman looking back at her seemed both familiar and strange. She had the same face she had always had, but there was something different in her eyes, something that had not been there before. She sent for Harold Bennett, the sympathetic official who had spoken with Thomas after the incident. Harold arrived looking nervous and uncertain, clearly wondering why he had been summoned to the Queen Consort's chambers at such an early hour. Camilla invited him to sit down and told him that she needed his help with something important. She told him that she had made a decision about how to resolve the situation with Thomas Hartley, and that she wanted him to arrange a meeting. Harold's eyebrows rose in surprise. He asked what kind of meeting she had in mind. Camilla took a deep breath and told him that she wanted to meet with Thomas Hartley privately, just the two of them, no officials or advisors or cameras. She wanted to speak with him directly, to address what had happened in a way that could not happen through official channels. For a moment, Harold seemed unable to respond. This was unprecedented. Members of the royal family did not have private meetings with guards who had publicly defied them. The protocols did not allow for such things. The traditions had nothing to say about such a situation because no one had ever imagined it could occur. But Harold was a wise man who had seen much in his years at the palace. He understood that sometimes the protocols and traditions needed to give way to something more fundamental. He told Camilla that he would arrange the meeting, that he would ensure it remained private and confidential. He asked only one question. He asked her what she hoped to accomplish. Camilla thought for a long moment before answering. She said that she was not entirely sure, but that she knew the current situation could not continue. She said that the country was divided, the palace was in turmoil, and, at the center of it all were two people who had never actually spoken to each other.
Perhaps it was time to change that. Harold nodded slowly and went to make the arrangements.
Thomas was surprised when he received the summons. He was even more surprised when Harold explained what the summons was for.
A private meeting with the Queen Consort?
It made no sense. What could she possibly want to say to him that could not be said through official channels?
Was this some kind of trap, a way to get him alone so that she could deliver some devastating punishment without witnesses?
Margaret, when he told her about it, was equally confused. She worried about what Camilla might be planning, worried about what might happen to her husband behind closed doors. But she also saw something in Thomas's eyes, a kind of calm acceptance that she had come to recognize over the years. He was not afraid.
Whatever was coming, he was ready to face it.
The meeting was scheduled for the following morning, in a small private sitting room that was rarely used.
Thomas arrived early, dressed in civilian clothes as instructed.
He was shown into the room by Harold, who wished him luck and, then, quietly withdrew, closing the door behind him. The room was smaller than Thomas had expected, decorated in soft colors with comfortable furniture and large windows overlooking a private garden. It felt almost domestic, a strange contrast to the grandeur of the palace's public spaces. Thomas stood near the window, looking out at the garden, waiting. He did not have to wait long. The door opened, and Camilla entered. She was alone, as promised, with no aides or assistants accompanying her. She closed the door herself and stood for a moment, looking at Thomas with an expression he could not quite read. They faced each other across the room, two people from vastly different worlds, connected by an incident that had shaken the foundations of their lives. Neither spoke at first. The silence stretched out, filled with all the weight of what had happened between them. Finally, Camilla moved to a chair and sat down. She gestured to another chair nearby, inviting Thomas to sit as well. He hesitated for a moment, then accepted the invitation. They sat facing each other, close enough to speak quietly, far enough apart to maintain a certain formality.
Camilla spoke first.
She said that she had asked for this meeting because she needed to say something to him, something that could not be said through official channels or public statements. She said that she had spent many sleepless nights thinking about what happened in the courtyard, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. She had examined it from every angle, had questioned her own actions, had struggled with feelings she was not accustomed to feeling.
Thomas listened without interrupting.
His face was calm, his hands resting quietly on his knees. He had no idea where this was going, but he was willing to hear whatever she had to say.
Camilla continued.
She said that when she demanded that young guard kneel, she had not been thinking about him as a person. She had been thinking about her own authority, her own image, her own need to be respected. She had seen his small movement as a challenge, an insult, an attack on everything she had worked so hard to achieve. She had reacted with anger and pride, the same anger and pride that had helped her survive the difficult years of public hostility. But, since that day, Camilla said, she had been forced to look at herself more honestly than she ever had before. She had read about Thomas's service record, had learned about his years of dedication and sacrifice. She had also learned about the young guard, James Morrison, about his background and his aspirations. These were not faceless servants or interchangeable uniforms. These were human beings with their own stories, their own dignity, their own worth. Thomas felt something shift inside him as he listened to these words. He had expected many things from this meeting, but he had not expected this. He had not expected the Queen Consort to sit across from him and speak with such vulnerability, such honesty. It did not align with anything he thought he knew about her. Camilla paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. Then, she said the words that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. She said that she was sorry. She said that what she did in the courtyard was wrong, that demanding a man kneel in humiliation was cruel and unjust, that Thomas had been right to stand up against it. She said that she wished she had handled things differently, wished she had shown more compassion, wished she had been a better person in that moment. The room fell silent again. Thomas stared at Camilla, trying to process what he had just heard. An apology.
From the queen consort to a guard who had publicly defied her. It was extraordinary, unprecedented, almost unbelievable. And, yet, looking into her eyes, Thomas could see that she meant every word. He took a deep breath before responding. He told her that he accepted her apology, that he appreciated her honesty and her courage in saying what she had said. He told her that he had not expected this, had not known what to expect from this meeting. He had simply come prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. But Thomas also felt that he needed to say something more. He told Camilla that he had not defied her out of disrespect or rebellion. He told her that he believed in the monarchy, believed in the traditions and the history that the crown represented. He had given more than 2 decades of his life to serving the royal family, and that service had meant everything to him. What he could not do, Thomas said, was stand by and watch another human being be humiliated for no good reason. What he could not do was remain silent when something inside him was screaming that what was happening was wrong. He had made a choice in that moment, a choice that might cost him everything he had worked for. But it was the only choice his conscience would allow. Camilla nodded slowly as he spoke. She said that she understood, that she had come to understand during the long weeks since the incident. She said that Thomas had shown her something that day, something about the difference between authority and respect, between power and dignity. She said that she was grateful for the lesson, even though it had been painful to learn. The conversation continued for more than an hour. They talked about the palace, about the pressures and expectations that came with their respective roles. They talked about the public reaction to the incident, about the divisions it had revealed in the country and in the palace itself. They talked about what might happen next, about the possibilities that lay ahead. As they talked, something remarkable happened. The distance between them began to close, not in a physical sense, but in something deeper. They began to see each other not as adversaries or as symbols, but as human beings. Camilla saw the soldier who had dedicated his life to service, the husband who loved his wife, the grandfather who read stories to his grandchildren. Thomas saw the woman who had endured years of public hatred, who had fought for her place in a world that did not want her, who was struggling even now to be worthy of the role she had been given. Neither of them would have predicted that they could find common ground. Neither of them would have believed that this meeting could lead to anything other than confrontation or compromise. But, sometimes, when two people sit down together and speak honestly, walls that seemed insurmountable begin to crumble. At the end of the meeting, Camilla made a proposal. She said that she wanted to make a public statement about what had happened, a statement that would acknowledge her mistake and recognize Thomas's courage. She said that she wanted to meet with James Morrison as well, to apologize to him directly for what she had put him through. And she said that she wanted Thomas to remain in his position, to continue serving as a royal guard, with no punishment or demotion or transfer. Thomas was stunned. He had been prepared to lose his job, his pension, everything he had worked for. He had made peace with that possibility, had accepted it as the price of following his conscience. But here was the queen consort, offering him not punishment but redemption, not condemnation but recognition. He asked her why. Why would she do this? Why would she publicly admit her mistake, publicly praise the man who had defied her? Surely her advisors would counsel against it, surely the officials would argue that it set a dangerous precedent. Why would she take such a risk? Camilla was quiet for a moment before answering. She said that she had spent much of her life trying to protect herself, to defend her position, to maintain her image. She had learned to be careful, to be strategic, to always think about how things would look to others. It had helped her survive, but it had also made her hard in ways she did not like. What Thomas did in the courtyard, Camilla said, had forced her to look at herself in a new way. It had shown her that there were more important things than image and authority and self-protection. It had reminded her of values she had once held dear but had somehow lost along the way. She did not want to be the kind of person who punished someone for doing the right thing. She wanted to be better than that. And, perhaps, she added, her public apology could do some good for the country as well. The nation was divided, not just about this incident but about many things. People were angry and distrustful, quick to attack each other, slow to listen or understand.
If the queen consort could admit she was wrong, could apologize publicly and, sincerely, maybe it would inspire others to do the same. Maybe it would show that humility and growth were possible for anyone, regardless of their position.
Thomas sat with these words for a long moment.
He thought about his father, about the values he had been raised with.
He thought about Margaret and their children and grandchildren.
He thought about James Morrison and all the other young guards who looked up to him. He thought about what it meant to serve, truly serve, not just a crown or an institution but the ideals that made service worthwhile. Finally, he told Camilla that he would accept her proposal. He told her that he was honored by her honesty and her courage. He told her that what she was planning to do was extraordinary, and that he believed it could make a real difference in how people saw the monarchy and each other. They stood and shook hands, a simple gesture that carried enormous weight. Two people who had been adversaries, who had been caught up in a confrontation that could have destroyed them both, had found a way forward together. It was not forgiveness in the simple sense, not the erasing of what had happened. It was something more complicated and more valuable.
It was understanding.
Harold Bennett was waiting outside when the meeting ended. He looked at their faces, trying to read what had transpired behind the closed door. What he saw surprised him. There was peace in both of them, a resolution that he had not expected. When Camilla quietly told him what she planned to do, Harold felt his eyes grow moist. In all his years at the palace, he had never witnessed anything quite like this. The news of what was coming spread quickly through the palace. Officials who had been debating for weeks suddenly found their debates rendered irrelevant. Staff members who had been divided suddenly found themselves united in astonishment.
The queen consort was going to apologize publicly? She was going to acknowledge that she had been wrong?
It was almost impossible to believe. But believe it they would have to, because Camilla was determined. She began working with her communications team on a statement, one that would be honest without being melodramatic, sincere without being mawkish.
It was not easy.
Every word had to be chosen carefully, every phrase weighed and considered.
But Camilla was patient.
She knew that this was perhaps the most important thing she had ever said in public, and she wanted to get it right. Meanwhile, Thomas returned to his duties with a new sense of purpose. Word had already begun to spread among the guards about the meeting, though the details remained unclear. His colleagues looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and respect, wondering what had happened, wondering what it meant. Thomas simply smiled and went about his work, knowing that all would be revealed in time.
The day before the public statement was scheduled, Camilla met with James Morrison.
It was a shorter meeting than the one with Thomas, but no less significant. James was nervous and uncertain, still traumatized by what had happened in the courtyard. He did not know what to expect from the woman who had humiliated him. What he received was a heartfelt apology. Camilla told him that she was sorry for what she had done, that she had no right to treat him the way she did. She told him that his small movement in the courtyard was not a crime, was not even a mistake. She told him that he was a good guard and a good person, and that she hoped he would continue in his service without letting the incident define his career.
James struggled to speak, overcome by emotion.
Finally, he managed to thank her, to tell her that her words meant more to him than she could know. He had been carrying the shame of that moment for weeks, had been haunted by it in his dreams. Her apology lifted a weight from his shoulders that he had not fully realized he was carrying. When James left the meeting, he went straight to find Thomas Hartley. The two men embraced, tears in their eyes. James told Thomas that he would never forget what he had done, never stop being grateful for the courage that had saved his dignity. Thomas told James that the courage was in both of them now, that what mattered was what they did going forward. The night before the public statement, Thomas and Margaret sat together in their living room. The television was off, the house was quiet. They held hands and talked about everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen. Margaret told Thomas that she was proud of him, not just for what he did in the courtyard, but for the grace he had shown throughout the crisis. Thomas told Margaret that he could not have done any of it without her, that her support had been his anchor in the storm. They talked about the future, about what it might hold.
The statement tomorrow would change things, though neither of them could predict exactly how.
There would be reactions and opinions, praise and criticism. There would be new challenges and new opportunities. But, whatever came, they would face it together, just as they always had. Before they went to bed, Thomas stood by the window and looked out at the night sky over London. He thought about his father, about all the men and women who had served before him. He thought about what service really meant, about the sacrifices and the rewards, the duties and the privileges. He thought about the young guard James Morrison, about the future that lay ahead of him. He thought about Camilla, about the unexpected journey they had both taken. And, as the stars shone down on the city he loved, Thomas Hartley felt at peace. Whatever tomorrow brought, he was ready. He had done what he believed was right, and that was enough. Tomorrow, the world would hear what the Queen Consort had to say. Tomorrow, everything would change. But, tonight, there was peace. The morning of the public statement dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Camilla rose early, having slept fitfully, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She went through her morning routine with careful attention to every detail, finding comfort in the familiar rituals. She knew that by the end of this day, her life would be different. She knew that the words she was about to speak would be analyzed and debated for years to come. But she was not afraid. For the first time in a very long time, she felt certain of what she was doing. The statement was scheduled for 11 o'clock, to be delivered from a formal reception room in the palace. Cameras from news organizations around the world had been invited. The International Press Corps, which had been following the story with intense interest, was gathered in force. Security was tight, with extra guards posted throughout the palace grounds. Everyone understood that this was a moment of historic significance. In her chambers, Camilla reviewed the statement one final time. She had worked on it for days, refining every sentence, weighing every word. Her communications team had offered suggestions and revisions, but the core of the statement was entirely her own. It had to be. This was not a political speech or a ceremonial address. This was something far more personal, and it needed to come from her heart. The statement began with an acknowledgement of what had happened in the courtyard. Camilla described the incident in plain terms, without euphemism or deflection. She acknowledged that she had demanded a young guard kneel in humiliation, that she had allowed her anger and pride to override her judgment and compassion. She did not make excuses or offer explanations. She simply stated the facts of what she had done. Then came the crucial part. Camilla apologized, clearly and unequivocally, to James Morrison, to Thomas Hartley, and to everyone who had been affected by her actions. She said that what she did was wrong, that it violated the principles of dignity and respect that should guide everyone, regardless of their position. She said that she was deeply sorry for the pain she had caused and the divisions her actions had created. But the statement went further. Camilla spoke about what she had learned from the experience, about how Thomas Hartley's act of courage had forced her to examine herself in ways she had long avoided. She spoke about the shell she had built around herself over the years, the defenses she had constructed to survive the hostility and rejection she had faced. She acknowledged that those defenses had sometimes hardened into something less admirable, something that allowed her to treat others with less compassion than they deserved. She praised Thomas Hartley by name, calling him a man of extraordinary integrity and courage. She said that his willingness to speak up, even at great personal risk, exemplified the best of British values. She announced that there would be no punishment for his actions, that he would continue in his role as a royal guard with her full support and gratitude. The statement concluded with a reflection on what the incident might mean for the nation as a whole. Camilla spoke about the divisions that existed in society, the tendency to attack and condemn rather than listen and understand. She expressed hope that her willingness to admit her mistakes might inspire others to do the same, might show that growth and humility were possible for everyone. She acknowledged that words alone were not enough, that the real test would be in her actions going forward. But she committed herself to trying to be better, to treating everyone she encountered with the dignity and respect they deserved. As Camilla finished reviewing the statement, there was a knock at her door. It was her chief aide, letting her know that the time had come. The cameras were ready, the reporters were assembled, the world was waiting.
Camilla took a deep breath, smoothed her clothing, and walked out to face whatever lay ahead.
The reception room was bright with lights and filled with the murmur of voices. Journalists from dozens of countries sat in rows of chairs, their notebooks and recording devices at the ready.
Television cameras lined the back of the room, their red lights blinking steadily. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Camilla entered the room and walked to the podium that had been set up in front of a large window. She stood there for a moment, looking out at the assembled faces. She saw skepticism in some eyes, curiosity in others, hostility in a few. She understood that she could not please everyone, that there would be those who dismissed her words as insincere or calculated. But she also knew that there would be others who heard what she had to say and were moved by it. That was enough. She began to speak, her voice clear and steady. The room fell silent instantly, every person straining to hear every word. As Camilla delivered her statement, reading from prepared notes but occasionally looking up to make eye contact with her audience, something remarkable happened. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The skepticism and hostility that had been present at the start slowly gave way to something else. People were listening, really listening, to what she had to say. When she reached the part about apologizing to James Morrison and Thomas Hartley, Camilla's voice wavered slightly. It was a tiny crack in her composure, barely noticeable, but it conveyed more than 1,000 perfectly delivered words could have. This was not a performance. This was real. The statement took about 15 minutes to deliver. When it was finished, Camilla remained at the podium for a moment, looking out at the crowd. Then, she nodded slightly and turned to leave, ignoring the shouted questions from reporters who wanted more. She had said what she needed to say. The rest was up to others to interpret. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, clips from the statement were being shared across social media platforms around the world. News anchors broke into regular programming to discuss what had just happened. Opinion columnists began writing their takes, their fingers flying across keyboards as they tried to capture the significance of the moment. The response was, as might be expected, deeply divided. Some praised Camilla for her courage and honesty, calling the statement a model of accountability and grace. They said it was one of the most remarkable public apologies they had ever witnessed, a genuine act of humility from someone who could easily have chosen to protect her image instead. They expressed hope that the statement would mark a turning point, not just for the monarchy but for public discourse in general. Others were more cynical. They dismissed the statement as a calculated public relations move, designed to repair Camilla's reputation rather than to express genuine remorse. They pointed out that she had only apologized after weeks of mounting pressure, after the story had become impossible to ignore. They questioned whether her words would be matched by her actions, whether this was real change or just skillful damage control. And there were those who simply could not forgive what had happened in the courtyard. For them, the image of a young guard being ordered to kneel was too powerful, too disturbing to be erased by any apology. They argued that someone who could behave that way in the first place was not deserving of trust or respect, no matter what they said afterward. They predicted that Camilla would eventually revert to her old patterns, that the apology was just a temporary mask on an unchanging face. But, regardless of the reactions, one thing was clear. The statement had changed the conversation. People who had been firmly opposed to Camilla were at least willing to consider whether she might be sincere. People who had supported Thomas Hartley were pleased that his courage had been recognized and rewarded. And people who had been disturbed by the divisions the incident had caused were heartened by the possibility of reconciliation. At the palace, the staff reacted with a mixture of relief and astonishment. The tension that had pervaded the corridors for weeks began to dissipate, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. People talked openly about what Camilla had said, discussed what it might mean for the future. Some remained skeptical, but many were genuinely moved. They had never expected anything like this, and they were not quite sure how to process it. Thomas Hartley watched the statement on a small television in the guards' quarters, surrounded by his colleagues. When Camilla spoke his name, praised his integrity and courage, Thomas felt tears welling in his eyes. He had not expected to be singled out in this way, had not expected his actions to be celebrated rather than condemned. Around him, the other guards were silent, watching his face, waiting to see how he would react. When the statement ended, they erupted in applause. They clapped Thomas on the back, shook his hand, embraced him. These were men who had been trained to suppress their emotions, to remain stoic under all circumstances. But, in that moment, they could not contain their feelings. They had witnessed something extraordinary, and their colleague was at the center of it. James Morrison watched from a different part of the palace, alone in a quiet corner. He had been dreading this day, uncertain of what Camilla would say, afraid that he might be mentioned in a negative way. When he heard her apology, heard her acknowledge what she had done to him, James broke down completely. The tears he had been holding back for weeks finally came pouring out, a flood of relief and release. He thought about what he had endured since the incident. The shame, the fear, the nightmares that came in the night. He thought about how close he had come to leaving the guard, to walking away from everything he had worked for. He thought about Thomas Hartley, about the moment when Thomas had helped him to his feet, had told him to return to his position with his dignity intact. Now, finally, it felt like that dignity had been fully restored. The Queen Consort herself had acknowledged her mistake, had apologized publicly, had recognized that what she did was wrong. James knew that the memory of kneeling in that courtyard would never completely fade. But it no longer defined him. He could move forward now, could continue his career without the weight of that moment dragging him down. That evening, there was an informal gathering of palace staff in one of the common areas. It was not an official event, not something that appeared on any schedule. It simply happened organically, as people drifted together to process what they had witnessed. Guards and servants, administrators and aides, people who might not normally interact found themselves sharing their thoughts and feelings. Thomas Hartley was there, somewhat reluctantly. He was not comfortable being the center of attention, preferred to do his job quietly and go home to Margaret. But the other staff members wanted him there, wanted to express their gratitude and admiration. So he stayed, accepting their words with grace and humility. At one point, Harold Bennett stood up and asked for everyone's attention. He spoke about what had happened over the past weeks, about the crisis that had threatened to tear the palace apart. He spoke about Thomas's courage, about Camilla's apology, about the unexpected resolution that no one had anticipated. Then, he raised a glass and proposed a toast, not to any individual but to the possibility of growth and change, to the hope that people could learn from their mistakes and become better. The room raised their glasses in response. It was a moment of unity, of shared purpose, that transcended the normal hierarchies and divisions of palace life. In that moment, they were not guards or servants or officials. They were simply people, connected by their common humanity and their common experience. Margaret Hartley had watched the statement at home, tears streaming down her face as she heard the Queen Consort praise her husband. When Thomas came home that evening, late because of the gathering at the palace, she was waiting for him at the door. They held each other for a long time, not speaking, not needing to speak. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. That night, lying in bed beside his wife, Thomas thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the morning he had stepped out of formation, the moment he had decided to speak. He thought about the conversations with Harold Bennett, with Camilla, with James Morrison. He thought about the statement he had watched that afternoon, the words that had vindicated his actions in front of the entire world. Had he known, when he made his decision in the courtyard, that things would turn out this way? No, he had not. He had acted without knowing the consequences, without any guarantee of a positive outcome. He had simply done what his conscience demanded, trusting that the rest would work out somehow. And now here he was, on the other side of the crisis, his career intact, his reputation enhanced, his principles proven right. It was more than he could have hoped for, more than he had any reason to expect. He felt profound gratitude, not for the recognition or the praise, but for the opportunity to have witnessed something truly remarkable. He had seen a powerful person choose humility over pride, growth over defensiveness. He had seen the possibility of change demonstrated in the most unlikely of circumstances. Margaret stirred beside him, and he reached out to touch her hand. She squeezed back, letting him know she was awake, letting him know she was there. They lay together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city outside,
feeling the peace that had finally settled over their lives. In the days that followed, the impact of Camilla's statement continued to ripple outward. Political commentators discussed it on news programs, analyzing its implications for the monarchy and for society at large. Social psychologists weighed in on the nature of public apologies and their effects on public perception. Religious leaders cited it as an example of repentance and reconciliation. The international press was particularly fascinated by the story. Here was a tale that transcended borders and cultures, a universal story of power and principle, cruelty and redemption. It's